I set the soup bowl in front of the man who had shot my father, and I said, "Please enjoy your meal," and I meant it, and I did not mean it, and both of those things were simultaneously and completely true in a way that I have spent 53 years trying to explain to people who were not in that dining room on that January evening in 1943, and who therefore cannot fully understand how a person contains that kind of contradiction without breaking apart. I was 23 years old, and I had been a novice at the convent of St. Rosa in Tarnow for 14 months, and I had taken no final vows yet because the war had interrupted the orderly progression of religious formation, the way it interrupted everything orderly and final in Poland between 1939 and 1945. I was still becoming a nun when the Germans requisitioned the convent's dining facilities for the use of the officers stationed in the Tarnov district, and I was still becoming a nun when I carried the soup tureen into the dining room on that January evening and looked across the table and saw the face of the man I had last seen standing in the courtyard of my family's home in the village of Rzepiennik-Strzejewski on a September morning in 1942, giving an order that I had heard clearly through the cellar window where I was hiding, an order after which I had heard 4 shots, and then silence, and then the sound of boots on the courtyard stones walking away. My name is Sister Małgorzata Sobolewska, and I served dinner to those men for 11 months, and I never told them who I was, and I am going to tell you why. And the why is more complicated than people expect when they first hear this story, because the obvious answer, that I was afraid, is true but incomplete, and the complete truth is what I owe to the memory of my father and my mother and my 2 brothers, whose names were Josef and Stanisław, and who were 17 and 14 years old respectively when they died in that courtyard. I need to tell you who I was before September 1942, because who I was before determines everything about who I was in that dining room and why I made the choices I made. I grew up in Rzepiennik-Strzejewski in the Tarnov district, the eldest of 4 children of a family that had farmed the same land for 4 generations. My father, Benedict Sobolewski, was not a man who drew attention to himself, but he was a man of profound and quiet conviction, the kind of conviction that does not announce itself but simply determines every action without exception. He had been hiding a Jewish family in the barn behind our house since October 1941, the Goldberg family, a mother and her 3 children whose father had been taken in the first roundup and who had nowhere else to go. My father knew the risk. He had explained it to my mother, and she had agreed, and they had explained it to me and my brothers with the seriousness that the situation required, which is to say completely and without softening. Because my father believed that people who are asked to take serious risks deserve serious information about what they are taking. The Goldberg family was in our barn on the September morning in 1942 when someone, whose name I learned years later and will carry with me to my grave, informed the German garrison in Tarnów of their presence. I was in the cellar retrieving preserves for lunch when the trucks arrived. I heard everything through the small cellar window. I heard the orders and the protests and the silence after the shots, and I stayed in that cellar for 6 hours after the trucks left before I could make my body move. The Goldberg family had been taken 2 days earlier, moved to a different location by a member of the local resistance who had gotten word that the garrison was conducting searches in our area. They were alive because of that warning, which is something I held on to in the cellar during those 6 hours. The knowledge that the act of sheltering them had not ultimately failed them, even if it had destroyed my family. I emerged from the cellar into a courtyard that I will not describe in detail because some details belong only to the person who saw them, and I have kept these particular ones inside myself for 53 years, and I will keep them there. I went to my nearest neighbor, a woman named Pani Kowalczyk who had known my family all her life, and she took me in and wept over me and then helped me do what needed to be done. And 3 weeks later, when the immediate shock had settled into something more durable and more terrible, she was the one who suggested that I go to the convent of St. Rosa in Tarnów, where the sisters were known to accept young women in crisis without requiring them to be in the appropriate spiritual state for religious formation. She said it was the safest place available for a young woman alone with no family and no resources in an occupied town, and she was right, and I went. The Sisters of St. Rosa did not ask me excessive questions during my first months there. Mother Superior Claudina was a woman of 60 who had seen enough of what the occupation produced in human beings to understand that some arrivals require space before they require explanation. and she gave me space and work and the structure of the daily offices and the company of the other sisters, and she waited. I began to find something in that structure that I had not expected to find. Not comfort, exactly, but a framework for continuing to exist that did not require me to have resolved what had happened to me, which was fortunate because I had not resolved it and was not close to resolving it. I began my formal formation as a novice 6 months after arriving. It was not a simple or straightforward process. There were days when the prayers felt like they were in a language I no longer spoke, and days when they were the only thing holding me together, and I learned to accept both kinds of days as part of the same process, which Mother Superior Claudina told me was more honest progress than people who only had one kind of day. The Germans arrived at the convent in October 1942, 13 months after my family's death. They did not requisition the building, which was too small and too inconveniently located for their administrative purposes, but they did establish a requirement that the convent's kitchen and dining facilities be made available for the use of the officers stationed in the district 3 evenings per week, a requirement that was communicated as a choice but was understood by everyone present as what it actually was. Mother Superior Claudina accepted the requirement with the measured compliance that the situation demanded, which is to say, she accepted it completely and made no protests that would bring additional scrutiny, while ensuring that the sisters understood that serving these meals was a form of survival rather than a form of cooperation. I was assigned to the serving, along with Sister Dominica and a lay worker named Bazia, because I was the youngest and the most physically capable, and because Mother Superior Claudina, who did not yet know the full story of my family, had assessed me as the sister with the steadiest temperament for difficult work. The first evening of service passed without incident. I carried dishes and poured water and moved through the dining room with the eyes-down efficiency that the role required, and I did not look at the officers' faces because looking at faces was not part of the work, as I understood it that first evening. The second evening was the same. The third evening, which was a Friday in early November, I was carrying a tureen of beet soup from the kitchen to the serving table when I looked up for a moment to navigate around a chair that had been pulled out from the table, and I saw him. He was sitting 3 places from the end of the right side of the table, a Hauptmann of perhaps 40, heavyset, with a scar along his left jawline that I had seen from the cellar window when he turned his head to give the order. My hands continued carrying the tureen to the serving table. I set it down without spilling a drop. I returned to the kitchen and I stood against the wall beside the stove and I breathed, simply breathed, until the breathing was steady enough that I could return to the dining room and finish the service. His name, I learned through the careful listening of subsequent weeks, was Hauptmann Werner Schaefer. He was a regular presence at the Thursday dinners. He was liked by the other officers in the way that men who tell good stories are liked, and he told stories with the ease of someone who has never had to account for the content of the stories he tells. I served him dinner 7 times over the following weeks, and each time I did, I conducted the internal process that I had begun on that Friday evening in November, the process of deciding what I was going to do and why and what the decision would cost and what it would produce, because I was 23 years old and I had been trained by my father to think about consequences before acting, and the training had survived everything that had happened to me and was the most intact thing I possessed. The obvious action was revenge. I want to say this plainly because pretending the thought did not occur to me would be a lie, and lying about this specific thing would be a betrayal of my own experience that I am not willing to commit. I thought about it. I had access to the kitchen. I had access to what was served. I had 11 months of Sister Clara's knowledge of plants and their properties, knowledge she shared with all the novices as part of our preparation for the convent's charitable medical work, knowledge that included the properties of things that could be added to food. The thought was there. I am not ashamed that it was there. I am honest that it was there and honest about why I did not act on it. I did not act on it for reasons that came to me across those weeks of serving him his dinner, reasons that arrived not as arguments but as understanding, the kind of understanding that settles into you gradually rather than striking you at once. The first reason was my father. My father had hidden the Goldberg family not because he calculated that the benefit outweighed the risk, but because he believed that some things were simply what human beings owed each other, that the obligation to protect the vulnerable was not conditional on safety or convenience or even survival. He had acted from that belief, and it had killed him, and I had spent 14 months in a convent, learning to understand that the belief had not been wrong because the outcome had been terrible. The belief was right. the outcome was the cost. And the belief my father had lived by did not accommodate what I was contemplating, because what I was contemplating was the conversion of the dining room of the convent of St. Rosa into something that would make everything the sisters had built there, the sanctuary, the school, the charitable work, the protection of the women who had taken refuge there, including me, complicit in an act of violence that would bring consequences onto everyone in the building. My father had calculated consequences before acting. I was his daughter. I calculated them. The second reason was the investigation. I had learned through Sister Dominica, who had more extensive connections in the Tarnov community than anyone else at the convent, that there was a documentation effort underway, coordinated by people I was connected to only at a distance but whose work I understood and respected, to record the names and actions and identifying information of the officers responsible for the atrocities committed in the Tarnov district across the occupation. This effort was not revenge. It was evidence building, the patient accumulation of a record that would serve a process of legal accountability when the occupation ended and the accountability became possible. I had information that this effort needed. I had seen Schaefer's face from 4 meters in daylight. I had heard his voice giving an order. I could place him at a specific location on a specific morning in September 1942. That testimony in a post-war proceeding was worth more than anything I could accomplish in a kitchen with plants from Sister Clara's medical knowledge, because one removed one man and the other contributed to a process that could reach many men through mechanisms that would survive beyond the occupation and carry legal weight that private action could never carry. I provided my testimony to the documentation effort through Sister Dominica in January 1943, 2 months after I had recognized Schaefer. I provided his name, his rank, his physical description, the scar on his jawline, and my account of what I had witnessed from the cellar window on the September morning in 1942. I provided it in writing, in the careful, detailed language that my father had always insisted upon for anything important, signed with my full name, dated, witnessed by Sister Dominica. I do not know what ultimately happened to that testimony or to Werner Schaefer in the post-war period, because the documentation effort's records were dispersed and partially destroyed, and I never succeeded in tracing what became of the specific file my testimony contributed to. I live with that, not knowing the way I live with the other, not knowing that my life contains, which is to say, with the discipline of accepting that doing the right thing and knowing the outcome of the right thing are separate matters, and that the first is in your control and the second frequently is not. I served Schaefer his dinner for 11 months, and I never told him who I was, and I do not regret that silence. The silence was not cowardice, and it was not passivity, and it was not the absence of something. It was the presence of a calculation that my father had taught me to make, the calculation of what action produces the most good for the most people over the longest time, and the calculation had an answer that the silence served better than the alternative. I set the soup bowl in front of him and I said, "Please enjoy your meal," and I carried my father's name and my mother's name and my brother's names, Josef and Stanisław, across every one of those 11 months like the most sacred thing I possessed, which they were. And I protected them from the contamination of being part of a story that ended in a convent kitchen with plants from a medical garden. And I gave them instead to a document that carried my full name and the date and the truth of what I had seen. And I believe, with the faith that is both the easiest and the hardest thing I carry, that they deserved that document more than they deserved the other thing, and that my father, who calculated consequences before acting, would have agreed.